Let us begin today's video by delving deeper into the topic of refugees. Historically, and even today, conflicts, famine, natural disasters, along with political, religious, and economic oppression, have been dominant factors contributing to the creation of refugees. Refugees who attempt to attain permanent residence in the country to which they flee to are referred to as asylum seekers. The immigration laws of most countries distinguish asylum seekers from other categories of migrants and generally grant them preferential treatment in accordance with international law. A displaced person is someone who has been forced to leave their home because of violence, conflict, persecution, or natural disaster, but has not crossed an international border. Many displaced people eventually cross national boundaries, thus becoming refugees. Migration of refugees and their mobility has been a threat to the security of states, as we have been reminded daily since the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Millions of people moved to escape political violence, hunger, and deprivation, becoming refugees, asylum seekers, or internationally displaced people. At the beginning of 2011, UN estimates put the global refugee population at 10.5 million, and now almost 10 years later, it is much worse. The total population of concern for the UNHCR stands at almost 35 million, which is an upward trend. James F. Holyfield from the Southern Methodist University rightly mentions in his book Controversies in Globalization, we need to look at the political and legal causes and consequences of international migration.
The first wave of refugees was noticed by the world in 1948, which created 3.5 million refugees of Palestinians. Then, in 1967, when all of Palestine was occupied by Israel, a second wave of 400,000 Arab refugees were created out of 2.5 million Palestinians, which is roughly one-fifth of the population. They sought refuge and asylum in the neighboring Arab countries such as Jordan and Lebanon, living in dismal conditions. The refugee crisis started in the mid 20th century, which was caused due to the upheavals after the two world wars and decolonization, resulting in genocide, the displacement of massive numbers of people, and the radical redrawing of national boundaries, not only in Europe but around the world. Due to the new boundaries in Europe post World War II, new kinds of migration emerged, where millions of people sought asylum and refuge so as to escape from violence. This process repeated itself before the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. In the previous video, we mentioned how Myron Weiner spoke of refugees posing a threat to international stability and security. He also does mention certain regions from where refugee crises have stemmed. These would be the Balkans, West Asia, Transcaucasia, the Great Lakes region of Africa, and Southern Africa.
If looked at from an international law perspective, the global refugee crisis led to a new regime order being established by the 1950 Geneva Convention, giving states the right to control entry and exit of people to and from its territory. This had a downside for refugees, where nations with nationality principle in their policies closed their doors on helpless refugees. The Holocaust also led to the creation of the UN and a new body of refugee and human rights law. The 1951 UN Geneva Convention stressed that individuals or groups persecuted on the grounds of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, and holding certain political opinions would be recognized as refugees and granted asylum. However, these categories have been expanded to reflect a growing awareness of other forms of persecution. In many ways, the interaction of economic problems, political instability, and violence makes it difficult to separate economically motivated migrants from refugees. The 1951 Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugees established what we know today as the principle of asylum and non refoulement. This means an individual with a well founded fear of persecution, once admitted to the territory of a safe state, cannot be arbitrarily expelled or sent back to the state of his or her nationality. Many European governments, including Germany, had written liberal asylum provisions into their post World War II constitutions so as to avoid repeating the situation in which refugees perished because the other countries returned them to Nazi Germany.
Modern day refugees could probably be first identified from what is called the first wave of migration, which was post World War II and caused due to intensified political unrest and reasons. An apt example would be how the partition of Germany, the Cold War, and the division of Europe thanks to the Iron Curtain led to the exodus of ethnic populations seeking refuge to the democratic West. Until the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, 12 million German refugees arrived in West Germany. Another example would be the Vietnam conflict, which produced a mass exodus of Vietnamese people, with most of the refugees settling in the United States. As economic conditions deteriorated and as the communist government consolidated its power, many Vietnamese also sought refuge in the neighboring countries. More than 200,000 ethnic Chinese who lived in Vietnam fled to China when conflict erupted between China and Vietnam in 1978 and 1979. Another 70,000 Vietnamese arrived in Hong Kong. The second wave of refugee crisis was fueled by the collapse of the Soviet Union, leading to a dramatic increase of asylum seekers who sought out Western democracies for refuge. A new era was seen, with refugees surging upwards, similar to the post World War II atmosphere in Europe. An apt example of how the situation worsened was when war broke out in the Balkans, causing a resurgence of ethnic nationalism. America's invasion of Iraq led to more than 2 million refugees and internally displaced people. The conflict in Pakistan and Afghanistan created millions of refugees. For example, fighting in the Swat Valley in Pakistan forced nearly 3 million people to leave their homes. By mid 1990s, there were over 16 million refugees in the world, with two-thirds of them in West Asia and Africa. The UN system for managing refugee migration, which had been created during the Cold War primarily to accommodate those fleeing persecution under communist rule, suddenly came under enormous pressure. During this phase, the UNHCR overnight became the most important organization in the entire world, with the new global crisis at hand.
Despite the xenophobic pressures that were building in the 90s, European democracies maintained a relatively strong commitment to the international refugee and human rights regime. In this atmosphere of crisis, the second wave of refugees began at the end of the 1980s. Control policies were brought about to step up the external border control, such as Operation Gatekeeper and Hold the Line for the US Mexican border. Similarly, in Western Europe, the Schengen system was activated in 1985, which gave them the power to turn away refugees from the borders. In the early 1990s, over 1,000 foreigners a day were applying for asylum in Germany. However, the refugees, even when given asylum, faced the backlash of racial attacks as foreigners. Today, in the 21st century, a new issue pertaining refugees has popped up, with the nature of refugees being brought into question as to whether they are economic refugees or political refugees. The question then arises as to who is genuinely seeking asylum from a crumbling state scenario and yet gets rejected by advanced economic nations since they are thought of as economic settlers.
We would like to now bring your attention to how the global scenario seems with the advent of the 21st century when one thinks about refugee crises. In Africa, numerous ethnic conflicts and civil wars have left that continent with more than 4 million refugees. In the Middle East, violence against the Kurds has not only led to the growth of Kurdish refugees in the region, but also influenced many Kurds to seek refuge in Europe and North America. There are more than 500,000 Kurds in Western Europe, with Germany and France receiving most of them. Germany has about 400,000, while France has 60,000. Let us now take a look at a case study of the Syrian refugee crisis, which persists even as we speak and represents how the refugee issue has transcended over the last 80 years and more.
The Syrian civil war started on March 15, 2011, post the Arab Spring Revolution on social media. The Syrian youth, mostly students, came out onto the streets of the southern city of Dara. The President Bashar al Assad was quick to crush the peaceful protests down with armed violence against its own civilians. Soon after, international sanctions were imposed, and simultaneously, pressure groups, armed militant factions, and other nations swooped in, taking sides against or with the Assad regime. The indication of a new global refugee problem became evident by 2012 itself, when the first refugee camp was opened in Jordan near the Syrian border, Zaatari. Lebanon became a hotspot for Syrian refugees, as well as who were fleeing the war that had erupted in Syria, where they were being killed in the thousands in the crossfire. The Zaatari refugee camp was supposed to be a temporary settlement, but today, 8 years since the war has begun, it has become the home for crores of Syrians. By March 2013, the Syrian refugees had totaled up to 1 million, and by September 11th, it was double. The reasons for this were numerous. With the UN sanctions imposed, there was no food or clean water to survive. ISIL had already started breaking into Syria, and many factions were trying to stake territory. Not to mention the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime made Syria a living hell. By April 2014, Jordan opened up another refugee camp in Azraq, and it was reported that 1 million refugees had fled to Lebanon, which has approximately one quarter of the Syrian population in totality. By June 2014, the situation was getting even more dreadful, with the amount of refugees hitting 3 million. Europe felt the third wave of refugee crisis in the same year when about 100,000 Syrian refugees made their way into the continent to escape the violence and bloodshed.
From 100,000 refugees in June 2014, the number hit 1 million by 2015. Many nations reacted to the Syrian refugee crisis differently. Hungary erected a wall along its borders and, along with Serbia, ensured refugees did not enter Europe. The World Food Programme failed to provide rations to Jordan and Lebanon, the two main countries which were safe havens for the refugees of Syria. On a day to day basis, Greece saw thousands of refugees arriving in their country. The situation only went downhill, and finally, the whole world was realizing how refugees were not a problem of a region but of the entire world as a whole. Now, in 2019, Syria has come into its ninth year of civil war, with refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and Syria itself. The harsh weather, the sexual violence in refugee camps, and the pathetic living conditions have only made the Syrian refugee crisis the worst refugee crisis the world has ever seen. And it has also become a brutal reminder for Europe of the effects of the Holocaust and the Jews from the 1930s in Europe. Some nations have understood the gravity of the situation and given refugees a roof over their head, while some have brutally shut their borders on starving, freezing Syrians. The saddest aspect of the Syrian refugee crisis would be the children, who form a staggering 40% of the refugee population and are dying due to lack of aid and assistance. The fact is that we are watching the future of a nation collapse as every day thousands of Syrian children die.
In conclusion, the problem of refugees poses a heavy problem for countries which provide asylum to refugees. Host countries are extremely fearful of their economic impact and also the fact that their culture will get affected by that of the refugees. Host countries view refugees as harbingers of poverty and are skeptical about the culture of the refugees who come in. Often they do not want a mixture of such different ideals of life in their own society. However, displaced people should be seen as potential assets for local growth and development rather than a burden. Instead of short term policies towards refugees, governments can look into incorporating them into their long term plans. Investing in refugees to make them a functional part of the nation can result in a greater rehabilitation opportunity for the refugees as well, be beneficial for the host country's economy. Where host nations feel flustered by the increasing number of immigrants who cause a wealth drain, refugees will not just be earning their income within the host nation, but spending it there itself, along with the tax obligations they will have as citizens eventually once they are naturalized. Moreover, a potential for not just wealth gain, but even brain gain would be around the corner, since many refugees are educated or seek education once they have gained the necessary asylum so as to earn and sustain their families and themselves.